It was a chilly morning at JFK International Airport, the kind of day where the air feels crisp and full of promise. People from all over the world were rushing around, some dragging suitcases behind them, others clutching coffee cups as they hurried to catch their flights. Amidst the chaos stood a man who looked like he belonged in a boardroom rather than an airport terminal. Dressed sharply in a dark suit with polished shoes, he carried himself with confidence. This wasn't just any traveler. It was the chairman of one of the biggest airlines on the planet. The chairman had just returned from an important international meeting about aviation trends. He was tired but satisfied with how things had gone. As he walked through the crowded hallway toward baggage claim, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a call from his office team back home, likely wanting to hear how the summit went. With a polite smile, he answered the call and began discussing some key points while keeping an eye out for his luggage. Nearby, a police officer named Brian Delaney was patrolling the area. Brian wasn't exactly popular among his colleagues. He had a reputation for being too quick to act without thinking things through. Some even whispered that he often let personal biases cloud his judgment. But today he seemed focused, scanning the crowd for anything unusual. His eyes landed on the chairman, standing near the baggage carousel, talking animatedly on the phone. Brian's first thought? Something didn't seem right. The chairman's tone sounded assertive, almost commanding, which made Brian uneasy. To him, the way the man gestured with his free hand as he spoke came across as suspicious. Never mind that. This was a busy airport where people talked on phones all the time. Never mind that the chairman looked completely calm and composed. All Brian saw was someone who fit a vague stereotype in his mind. A black man dressed well, speaking confidently, and that alone triggered something in him. Without introducing himself or explaining why he was approaching, Brian stepped closer. "Excuse me, sir," he said loudly, interrupting the chairman mid-conversation. The chairman paused, lowering his phone slightly. "Yes? Can I help you?" he asked politely, clearly surprised by the sudden interruption. "I need to see your ID," Brian demanded, his voice firm and authoritative. The chairman blinked, taken aback. "My ID? Why?" he asked, his tone still respectful but tinged with confusion. After all, he hadn't done anything wrong. He was simply waiting for his bags after a long flight. But Brian wasn't interested in explanations. To him, the chairman's question felt like resistance, like defiance. And instead of de-escalating the situation, Brian doubled down. "You're acting suspicious," he said bluntly. "Now show me your ID." At this point, a small crowd had started to gather. Travelers passing by stopped to watch what was happening. A few exchanged glances, sensing that something wasn't quite right here. One woman whispered to her companion, "Isn't that the guy from Skylink Airlines? The big boss?" Another nodded, recognizing the chairman from news articles and interviews. The chairman tried again to reason with Brian. "Officer, I'm not sure what you think I've done, but I assure you, I'm just waiting for my luggage. If you'd like, I can explain further." His words were measured, calm, and professional, the kind of demeanor expected from someone in his position. But Brian wasn't listening anymore. In his mind, the chairman's refusal to immediately comply was proof. Enough of guilt. Before anyone could intervene, Brian reached for his handcuffs. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," he ordered gruffly. The chairman froze, disbelief washing over his face. Was this really happening? Here he was, a respected leader in the aviation industry, being treated like a criminal in front of dozens of witnesses. The sound of metal clicking into place echoed through the terminal as Brian secured the handcuffs around the chairman's wrists. Gasps rippled through the growing crowd. Some people pulled out their phones to record the scene, unable to believe what they were seeing. Others shook their heads in disgust, muttering under their breath about how wrong this whole situation felt. As the chairman stood there humiliated and restrained, Brian finally decided to check the man's identification. That's when he realized who he was dealing with. The name on the ID matched the face plastered across countless magazine covers and TV screens, the same person who led one of the most influential companies in the world. For a brief moment, Brian hesitated, perhaps realizing the gravity of his mistake. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. By now, the incident had drawn the attention of airport security personnel, who quickly intervened. They recognized the chairman and approached Brian, demanding answers. What followed was a tense exchange, with Brian struggling to justify his actions while the chairman remained silent, his expression unreadable. Eventually, the handcuffs were removed, but the emotional scars would take much longer to heal. Word spread fast within the airport. Employees whispered to each other, appalled by what had happened. Passengers posted videos online capturing snippets of the confrontation. By the time the chairman stepped outside to meet his chauffeur, the story was already gaining traction on social media. Little did anyone know, this single moment of injustice would spark a nationwide conversation about race, power, and accountability. And so, what began as an ordinary morning at JFK Airport turned into a pivotal chapter in the ICAO, or fight against systemic racism, one that would leave a lasting impact on everyone involved. By the time the chairman walked out of the airport, shaken but trying to keep his composure, the video clips of what had happened were already spreading like wildfire. Someone in the crowd had filmed the entire scene, the handcuffing, the confusion, the growing tension, and uploaded it online. Within minutes, the clip was shared thousands of times. People couldn't believe their eyes. A man who looked like a successful professional, someone who clearly belonged in that space, had been treated like a suspect without any real reason. Social media lit up with outrage. Comments poured in from all corners of the world. "This is unacceptable," one person wrote. Another added, "How can this still be happening in 2023? Hashtags started trending almost instantly. Unjust arrest, systemic racism exposed, and enough is enough began dominating platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. The story wasn't just about one incident anymore. It became a symbol of something much bigger, a reflection of frustrations felt by millions of people who had seen or experienced similar injustices. News outlets didn't waste any time jumping on the story. By late afternoon, major networks were airing reports about the incident. They interviewed passengers who had witnessed everything firsthand. One traveler, a middle-aged woman holding her toddler, told reporters, "It was horrifying to watch. This man did nothing wrong. He was calm, polite, and dressed so professionally. You could tell he was important, and yet the officer treated him like a criminal." Another witness, a young college student, described how the atmosphere shifted when the handcuffs came out. "Everyone went silent for a second," he said. "Then people started whispering, 'That's the airline guy. Why are they doing this?' It felt surreal, like we were watching something we shouldn't have to see in real life." As the day wore on, more details emerged. Reporters dug into the chairman's background, highlighting his accomplishments and contributions to the aviation industry. He wasn't just some random executive. He was a trailblazer, known for championing diversity and inclusion within his company. Articles popped up celebrating his leadership style and his efforts to make air travel accessible to underserved communities. The contrast between his achievements and the way he'd been treated made the situation even more infuriating to the public. Meanwhile, Skylink Airlines released an official statement condemning the officer's actions. "We are deeply disturbed by the events that unfolded today," the statement read. "Our chairman was subjected to unwarranted treatment based solely on prejudice. Such behavior has no place in our society, and we stand firmly against discrimination in all its forms." The airline also announced plans to support the chairman legally and emotionally as he navigated the aftermath of the ordeal. The chairman's lawyer held a press conference later that evening, addressing the growing concerns head-on. Standing in front of cameras outside a sleek office building, the lawyer laid out the facts clearly and concisely. "What happened today was not just an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Our client was targeted because of racial bias, plain and simple. We will be filing a lawsuit against the police department to hold them accountable for this egregious misuse of authority." He went on to explain that the lawsuit wouldn't just focus on seeking justice for the chairman. It would aim to push for broader reforms including better training for officers and stricter consequences for those who abuse their power. The lawyer ended the press conference by urging others who had faced similar situations to come forward and share their stories. "If you've been treated unfairly because of your race, know that you're not alone," he said. "Together, we can create change." As night fell, the conversation only intensified. Late-night talk show hosts weighed in, using their platforms to highlight the absurdity of the situation. Comedians joked about the irony of mistaking a top executive for a threat, but beneath the humor lay a serious critique of systemic racism. News anchors debated whether enough was being done to address these issues, while political commentators called for immediate action from lawmakers. Even celebrities joined the discussion. Actors, musicians, and athletes took to social media to express their anger and solidarity. Some shared personal stories of being racially profiled, adding fuel to the fire. Others posted messages of encouragement directly to the chairman, praising him for handling the situation with dignity despite the humiliation. But perhaps the most powerful voices came from ordinary people sharing their own experiences. Threads on Reddit and Facebook filled up with posts from individuals recounting moments when they had been judged, questioned, or harassed simply because of the color of their skin. These stories painted a vivid picture of what it meant to live under the shadow of racial bias, a reality that many white Americans might never fully understand. For the chairman himself, the day had been emotionally draining. After leaving the airport, he retreated to his home, where close friends and family gathered to offer support. Despite the overwhelming attention, he chose to stay quiet for now, needing time to process everything that had happened. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. In fact, it was only the beginning. As images of the incident continued to circulate, protests began forming outside police headquarters in New York City. Hundreds of people showed up, carrying signs that read, "No justice, no peace," and chanting slogans demanding accountability. Community leaders addressed the crowd, reminding everyone that this case was about more than one man. It was about dismantling the structures that allowed such injustices to occur in the first place. By the end of the day, it was clear that the incident at JFK Airport had struck a nerve. It wasn't just a news story, it was a catalyst for change. People across the country and around the world were talking about racism, privilege, and the urgent need for reform. For the chairman, this newfound spotlight brought both challenges and opportunities. While he hadn't asked for this kind of attention, he understood that his experience could serve as a turning point, a chance to shine a light on the struggles faced by countless others every single day. The days following the incident were a whirlwind of activity. The chairman, still reeling from the humiliation and shock of being handcuffed in public, found himself at the center of a storm he hadn't asked for. But as the story gained momentum, it became clear that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something much bigger, a chance to confront the deep-rooted issues of racial bias and systemic injustice that had plagued society for far too long. Back at the police department, pressure mounted quickly. Calls for accountability came pouring in from all directions, from ordinary citizens, civil rights organizations, government officials, and even celebrities who had thrown their weight behind the growing movement. The NYPD knew they couldn't ignore this. They needed to act fast, not just to save face, but to address the mounting fury over what many saw as yet another example of unchecked racism within law enforcement. An internal investigation was launched almost immediately. Supervisors pored over body camera footage, witness statements, and airport security tapes to piece together exactly what had happened. What they found painted a damning picture. The officer involved, Brian Delaney, had no valid reason to detain the chairman. There was no evidence of suspicious behavior, no threat posed, nothing that warranted pulling out handcuffs. In fact, the footage showed the chairman remaining calm and cooperative throughout the encounter, despite the escalating tension caused by Brian's aggressive approach. But this wasn't the first time Brian had come under scrutiny. As investigators dug deeper into his record, patterns began to emerge. Over the years, several complaints had been filed against him, alleging excessive force, racial profiling, and unprofessional conduct. Most of these complaints had been brushed aside or dismissed without serious consequences. This time, however, things were different. With the whole world watching, there was no room for excuses. Meanwhile, the chairman continued to grapple with the emotional toll of the incident. Despite the outpouring of support, he couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability that lingered. Friends and family tried to comfort him, reminding him how proud they were of how he handled the situation. "You didn't lose your cool," one close friend told him during a quiet moment at home. "Even when you were treated unfairly, you stayed composed. That takes strength." But staying composed didn't mean he wasn't affected. Late at night, when the house was silent, the chairman would sit alone in his study, replaying the events in his mind. He thought about the look on people's faces as they watched him get handcuffed, the shock, the disbelief, the anger. He thought about the whispers among the crowd, the way some recognized him and realized the absurdity of the situation. And he thought about the countless others who hadn't been so lucky, whose stories never made headlines because they didn't have cameras rolling or influential positions to amplify their voices. One evening, unable to sleep, he picked up his phone and scrolled through social media. The posts were endless. Messages of solidarity, calls for justice, personal stories of discrimination shared by strangers inspired to speak out. One comment stood out to him. "This could have been my dad, my brother, my uncle. Thank you for standing tall so we can finally talk about this." Reading those words brought tears to his eyes. For the first time, he began to see his experience not as an isolated event, but as part of a larger narrative, one that demanded action. Determined to channel his pain into purpose, the chairman decided to step forward publicly. He gave his first interview since the incident, sitting down with a trusted journalist known for covering social justice issues. Dressed simply in a dark sweater and jeans, he spoke candidly about how the arrest had impacted him. "It's not easy to describe what it feels like to be treated as less than human," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Especially when you've worked hard your entire life to prove yourself, to break barriers, to show that people who look like me deserve respect and equality." He went on to explain that while the incident was painful, it also reminded him of why his work mattered. "I've spent years advocating for diversity and inclusion, not just in my company but in every corner of our society. Now I realize that this fight is more important than ever. We can't let moments like this go unnoticed. We have to use them to spark change." His words resonated deeply, striking a chord with viewers around the world. Social media exploded again, this time with messages of admiration for his courage and resilience. People praised him not just for enduring the ordeal but for turning it into an opportunity to push for progress. Activists seized the moment, organizing rallies and town hall meetings to discuss ways to combat racial profiling and hold institutions accountable. At the same time, the police commissioner issued a statement acknowledging the seriousness of the situation. "What happened at JFK Airport was unacceptable," he said during a press conference. "We are committed to ensuring that such incidents do not happen again." He announced plans for sweeping reforms within the department, including mandatory anti-bias training, stricter oversight of officers with problematic records, and the creation of a task force dedicated to addressing systemic racism. While some welcomed these measures as steps in the right direction, others argued they didn't go far enough. Critics pointed out that true reform required more than just workshops and policy changes. It meant reallocating resources to focus on community engagement and mental health support, rather than relying solely on policing. Protesters outside police headquarters held signs reading "Reform isn't enough" and "Invest in communities, not cops," demanding deeper structural changes. Amidst all the noise, Brian Delaney remained largely silent. Suspended pending the outcome of the investigation, he avoided the spotlight, knowing full well that the tide had turned against him. Some of his colleagues defended him privately, claiming he was being scapegoated for a broader issue. But the majority understood that this was a reckoning long overdue. If anything, Brian's actions had exposed cracks in the system that couldn't be ignored any longer. For the chairman, the investigation's findings brought a mix of relief and frustration. On one hand, he was glad to see concrete action being taken. On the other, He knew that firing one officer wouldn't solve the problem. True change required sustained effort, uncomfortable conversations, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. As he prepared to return to work, he resolved to keep pushing for accountability, not just for himself but for everyone who had ever been treated unjustly because of the color of their skin. By the end of the week, the chairman's story had become a symbol of hope and defiance. It reminded people that even in moments of darkness, there was power in speaking up, in refusing to stay silent. And though the road ahead promised to be difficult, he felt ready to walk it, not just for himself but for the countless others counting on him to lead the way. The pressure on the police department reached a boiling point as the investigation into the incident unfolded. Every day brought new developments, and public scrutiny intensified with each passing hour. The chairman's case had become a litmus test for accountability within law enforcement, a moment that would either reinforce trust or deepen the divide between communities and those sworn to protect them. After weeks of review, the findings of the internal investigation were finally released. They confirmed what many already suspected. Officer Brian Delaney had acted out of line, driven by prejudice rather than evidence. His behavior during the encounter at the airport was deemed unjustified, unprofessional, and in violation of departmental policies. Worse still, his disciplinary record revealed a troubling history of similar incidents, none of which had been properly addressed before. This time, however, there was no room for leniency. Facing mounting criticism from all sides, the police commissioner made the decision to terminate Brian's employment immediately. The announcement sent shockwaves through the department. Some officers expressed quiet relief, knowing that such behavior had gone unchecked for too long. Others grumbled about the perceived unfairness of singling out one individual when systemic issues ran much deeper. But outside the walls of the precinct, the news was met with cautious optimism. Protesters gathered once again outside police headquarters, holding signs that read, "Accountability starts now," and "One down, many more to go." While firing Brian was a significant step, it wasn't enough to quell the growing demands for broader reform. Community leaders argued that removing one bad apple wouldn't fix the rot in the barrel. Local activists organized marches, demanding not just accountability, but systemic changes to address racial bias within policing. Politicians joined the chorus, introducing legislation aimed at creating independent oversight boards to investigate misconduct allegations. These boards would include representatives from marginalized communities, ensuring that voices often ignored in policy-making processes were finally heard. In response to the outcry, the NYPD announced a series of measures designed to rebuild trust and prevent future incidents. Mandatory anti-bias training became a top priority, with sessions led by experts in racial equity and social justice. Officers were required to participate in workshops that challenged their assumptions and encouraged empathy. Additionally, body cameras were made mandatory for all officers, with strict penalties for failing to activate them during interactions with the public. But perhaps the most ambitious initiative was the introduction of community policing programs. Instead of relying solely on traditional methods of enforcement, these programs focused on building relationships between officers and residents. Police departments partnered with local organizations to host neighborhood meetings, youth mentorship initiatives, and cultural exchange events. The goal was simple yet powerful: to humanize both sides and foster mutual understanding. Despite these efforts, skepticism remained. Critics pointed out that reforms like sensitivity training and body cameras had been tried before without lasting impact. What was needed, they argued, was a fundamental shift in how society approached safety and justice. Activists pushed for investments in education, healthcare, and job creation in underserved areas, arguing that addressing root causes of crime would reduce the need for heavy-handed policing altogether. Slogans like "defund the police" sparked heated debates, with some supporting reallocation of resources, while others feared losing essential services. For the chairman, watching these discussions unfold was both inspiring and exhausting. He saw firsthand how his experience had galvanized people to take action, but he also knew that change wouldn't come overnight. As someone who had spent years advocating for equality within his own industry, he understood the importance of persistence. Progress was rarely linear. It came in fits and starts, requiring constant vigilance and effort. Determined to contribute meaningfully, the chairman decided to use his platform to amplify the voices of those fighting for justice. He began attending rallies and town halls, standing shoulder to shoulder with activists and sharing their stories with his vast network of contacts. During one particularly moving event, he listened as a young woman recounted her own harrowing encounter with police profiling. Her voice trembled as she described being pulled over late at night for no apparent reason, her hands gripping the podium tightly. When she finished speaking, the crowd erupted in applause, moved by her courage. Inspired by moments like this, the chairman announced plans to launch a foundation dedicated to promoting equity and inclusion. Named after the very principles he had championed throughout his career, the initiative aimed to provide scholarships and mentorship opportunities for underrepresented youth. Its focus would be on fields traditionally dominated by privilege: aviation, law enforcement, technology, breaking down barriers that had kept talented individuals from succeeding. The foundation quickly gained traction, attracting support from corporations, philanthropists, and everyday citizens eager to make a difference. Fundraisers were held across the country, drawing crowds of people united by a shared vision of a fairer, more inclusive future. Stories of recipients poured in, students pursuing degrees in aerospace engineering, aspiring pilots training for their licenses, young entrepreneurs launching startups. All proof that systemic change was possible when people worked together. As momentum grew, the chairman found himself reflecting on the journey so far. From the humiliation of being handcuffed in public to becoming a symbol of resilience and hope, he had traveled a long road filled with challenges and triumphs. Yet, he knew the fight was far from over. Systemic racism was deeply entrenched, woven into the fabric of institutions and mindsets that resisted change. Undoing centuries of injustice would require patience, persistence, and unwavering determination. Still, there were glimmers of hope everywhere he looked. Conversations that once felt taboo were now happening openly, in classrooms, boardrooms, and living rooms. People were beginning to confront uncomfortable truths about privilege and bias, recognizing that silence only perpetuated harm. And slowly but surely, cracks were appearing in the walls of oppression, letting light seep through. Late one evening, as he sat alone in his study reviewing plans for an upcoming summit on racial equity, the chairman allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought about the countless lives touched by the movement sparked by his ordeal, the families inspired to speak up, the young dreamers emboldened to pursue careers they once thought impossible, the allies stepping forward to lend their voices to the cause. Though the path ahead promised to be difficult, he felt a deep sense of purpose knowing that he was part of something greater than himself. Change, he realized, wasn't just about grand gestures or sweeping reforms. It was about the small, everyday acts of courage, the willingness to listen, to learn, to stand up even when it was hard. And as long as people continued to do that, progress was inevitable. The chairman's journey toward healing wasn't an easy one. Even though he had become a symbol of resilience and hope for millions, the emotional scars from that day at the airport ran deep. Being handcuffed in public, treated like a criminal, without cause, had left him feeling vulnerable in ways he hadn't anticipated. No matter how many times people praised his composure or thanked him for standing tall, the memory of those cold metal cuffs around his wrists lingered in his mind. At first, he tried to push through it. He threw himself into work, pouring all his energy into running his airline and launching the foundation he'd created to promote equity. But no matter how busy he kept himself, there were quiet moments, late at night, early mornings, when the weight of everything came crashing down. He replayed the incident over and over in his head, wondering what he could have done differently, even though deep down he knew the fault didn't lie with him. One evening, after another long day of meetings and interviews, he sat alone on his balcony, staring out at the city skyline. The lights twinkled like stars against the dark sky, but they offered little comfort. His wife, who had been quietly observing his struggle, joined him outside. "You've been carrying this alone for too long," she said gently. Okay to not be okay. Her words struck a chord. For weeks he had convinced himself that he needed to stay strong, not just for himself but for everyone looking up to him. But now, hearing her say it was okay to feel broken, made something inside him shift. That night he decided to seek therapy. It wasn't an easy decision. Growing up, he had been taught to handle pain privately, to never show weakness. But he realized that true strength lay in acknowledging his struggles and working through them. Therapy became a safe space where he could unpack the emotions he'd bottled up. Week after week, he spoke candidly about the fear, anger, and frustration he felt, not just because of what had happened to him, but because of the larger issues it represented. His therapist encouraged him to channel those feelings into action, reminding him that personal healing and advocacy weren't mutually exclusive. Slowly but surely, he began to find balance. He learned techniques to manage stress, practiced mindfulness to stay grounded, and leaned on his loved ones for support when things got tough. As he worked on himself, the chairman also turned his attention outward. He wanted to ensure that others facing similar injustices wouldn't have to endure the same isolation he had felt. With the help of his team, he expanded the foundation's reach, focusing not just on scholarships, but on creating safe spaces for dialogue. They organized town halls where people could share their experiences with racial profiling and police misconduct. These events brought together individuals from diverse backgrounds, students, parents, activists, law enforcement officers, all united by a desire to understand each other better. One particular town hall stood out. Held in a community center, in a predominantly black neighborhood, it drew a crowd far larger than expected. People lined up to speak, their stories raw and powerful. A teenage boy recounted how he'd been stopped by police while walking home from basketball practice, simply because he fit the description. An elderly woman shared how she'd been frisked in front of her grandchildren during a routine traffic stop. Each story added another layer to the collective narrative of pain and resilience. Listening to these voices reignited the chairman's determination to fight for change. He realized that while policy reforms were crucial, they couldn't address the emotional toll of living under constant suspicion. To truly heal, communities needed more than laws. They needed connection, empathy, and trust. Inspired by this realization, he launched a new initiative within the foundation called Bridges of Understanding. The program paired young people from underserved areas with mentors in fields like aviation, law enforcement, and education. The goal was simple: to create opportunities for cross-cultural exchange and foster relationships that transcended stereotypes. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of volunteers signed up to mentor students eager to make a difference. One of the first participants was a 16-year-old girl named Maya, whose dream was to become a pilot. Growing up in a low-income household, she had never imagined such a career was possible for someone like her. Through the program, she was paired with a senior captain from Skylink Airlines, who took her under his wing, literally and figuratively. Together, they visited flight simulators, attended industry conferences, and talked endlessly about the future. By the end of the year, Maya had applied to aviation school, her confidence soaring thanks to the guidance and encouragement she received. Stories like Maya's reminded the chairman why he had started this journey in the first place. Every success, no matter how small, was proof that progress was possible. Yet he knew that systemic change required more than individual victories. It demanded sustained effort, uncomfortable conversations, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. So he continued to use his platform to advocate for broader reforms, speaking at conferences, writing op-eds, and meeting with policymakers to push for accountability and transparency in law enforcement. Despite the challenges, there were moments of joy and triumph that kept him going. At a global leadership summit held in Europe, he delivered a keynote speech that brought the audience to its feet. Standing on stage, he reflected on how far he and society had come since that fateful day at JFK Airport. Change doesn't happen overnight, he told the crowd. But when we stand together, speak truth to power, and refuse to accept injustice, anything is possible. His words resonated deeply, earning him a standing ovation. Afterward, dozens of attendees approached him to express gratitude, sharing their own stories of overcoming adversity. It was a humbling reminder that his experience had touched lives, far beyond what he could have imagined. Back home, the chairman celebrated smaller victories too. He watched as the foundation awarded its first round of scholarships, cheered on graduates of the mentoring program, and saw neighborhoods come alive with renewed hope thanks to community policing initiatives. Each milestone reinforced his belief that even in the darkest moments, light could shine through. Still, he remained acutely aware of the road ahead. Systemic racism was a deeply rooted problem, resistant to quick fixes. Undoing centuries of injustice would take generations of effort. But he found solace in knowing that he was part of a movement, a collective effort to build a fairer, more inclusive world. As he looked around at the faces of those who had joined him on this journey, young dreamers, seasoned activists, supportive allies, he felt a profound sense of purpose. The chairman's story was no longer just his own. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, everyone who had dared to rise above prejudice, and everyone who believed in the power of unity. And as he stood on the brink of a new chapter, he vowed to keep fighting, not just for himself but for the countless others counting on him to lead the way. Months had passed since the incident at JFK Airport, but its ripple effects continued to shape conversations across the country. What started as a single moment of injustice had grown into a movement, a catalyst for change that touched lives, far beyond what anyone could have predicted. The chairman's story wasn't just a headline anymore. It was a chapter in a much larger narrative about race, power, and accountability. By now, documentaries, books, and even a feature film were being made based on his experience. Filmmakers approached him with pitches, eager to capture the raw emotion and resilience that defined his journey. Journalists wrote profiles celebrating his leadership, while schools began incorporating discussions of his case into their curricula. Teachers used it as a starting point to talk to students about systemic racism, privilege, and the importance of standing up against discrimination. In classrooms from New York to California, young people debated what they would have done in his shoes, sparking meaningful conversations about fairness and justice. For the chairman, seeing his story inspire so many was both humbling and empowering. He often visited schools and community centers to speak directly with students, sharing lessons he had learned along the way. During one such visit, he stood in front of a packed auditorium of high schoolers, their faces filled with curiosity and admiration. "When I was your age," he began, "I never imagined I'd be where I am today. Life has a way of throwing challenges at you that test who you are and what you believe in. But I want you to remember this. Every challenge is also an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to make a difference." His words resonated deeply with the audience. Afterward, dozens of students lined up to ask questions or share their own dreams. One boy shyly admitted he wanted to be a police officer someday but worried about whether he could make a positive impact. The chairman knelt down to meet him at eye level and smiled. "Being a good officer isn't just about enforcing laws," he said. "It's about serving people, listening to them, respecting them, and protecting them. If you carry those values with you, you'll do great things." The boy beamed, clutching the chairman's business card like it was treasure. Time went on. The ripple effects of the incident spread even further. Local governments around the country introduced legislation inspired by the reforms implemented in New York. Independent oversight boards became a reality in several cities, giving marginalized communities a voice in holding law enforcement accountable. Activists celebrated these victories but remained vigilant, knowing there was still work to be done. Protests continued, not just against racial profiling but against all forms of inequality, housing discrimination, wage gaps, healthcare disparities. The chairman's story had ignited a fire that refused to die out. Meanwhile, Officer Brian Delaney faded into obscurity. Fired from the force and unable to find steady employment, he struggled to rebuild his life. Interviews he gave in an attempt to defend himself fell flat, met with widespread criticism. To the public, he had become a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked bias and abuse of power. While some argued that his punishment was too harsh, most agreed it was necessary to send a clear message. No one was above accountability. For the chairman, forgiveness remained a complex topic. He didn't harbor hatred toward Brian. That kind of bitterness would only weigh him down. But he also understood that true reconciliation required more than apologies. It demanded action. So when asked during an interview if he forgave the officer, he responded thoughtfully. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting or excusing what happened," he explained. "It's about choosing to move forward, not for his sake, but for mine. My focus is on creating a future where incidents like this don't happen again." That focus drove him to keep pushing boundaries. The foundation he had launched grew exponentially, expanding its programs to include not just scholarships and mentorship, but also advocacy training for young leaders. Participants learned how to organize campaigns, draft policy proposals, and engage with lawmakers effectively. Many went on to lead grassroots movements in their own communities, proving that change could start small but grow mighty. One of the most impactful initiatives was a partnership with local artists to create murals in neighborhoods affected by racial profiling. These vibrant works of art told stories of resilience and hope, transforming blank walls into symbols of unity. Passers-by stopped to admire them, snapping photos and reading the inscriptions etched beneath each piece. "This wall reminds us we're stronger together," read one inscription. Another declared, "Justice begins with understanding." The chairman attended the unveiling of one such mural in Brooklyn, standing alongside the young artist who had designed it. As they cut the ribbon together, cheers erupted from the crowd gathered around them. Parents lifted their children onto their shoulders to get a better view, while teenagers recorded videos to post online. For a brief moment, everyone forgot their differences and celebrated something bigger than themselves. Looking back on everything, the chairman realized how much he had grown, not just as a leader, but as a person. The incident at the airport had forced him to confront parts of himself he might otherwise have ignored. It had taught him the value of vulnerability, the strength in community, and the importance of using his platform for good. Though the scars of that day would always remain, they no longer defined him. Instead, they served as reminders of why he fought so hard, for equality, for justice, for a world where everyone could thrive without fear of prejudice. In quieter moments, he often reflected on the legacy he wanted to leave behind. It wasn't about fame or accolades. It was about making sure others didn't have to endure what he had gone through. Whether it was mentoring a young dreamer, advocating for policy, changes, or simply lending an ear to someone in need, he believed every act of kindness mattered. Together, those acts formed a tapestry of hope, a vision of a brighter, fairer future. And so, as the years rolled on, the chairman continued his work, fueled by the belief that progress was possible. His story served as proof that even in the darkest moments, courage could spark transformative change. From the halls of power to the streets of ordinary neighborhoods, his message echoed loud and clear. We are stronger when we stand together. Let's build a world where everyone belongs. With those words, he stepped off the stage, leaving behind a legacy that would inspire generations to come.